Hey folks, I'm Sean C. Davis, and I want to talk to you about a really interesting project that I've been a part of over the last couple of months. And it's this really massive migration from Gatsby to Next.js. And the frameworks are irrelevant here. The interesting part is much more about the process of making this migration. And what I've noticed in the past is that these projects often don't happen, and they don't happen because they're incredibly complex and they're really expensive. And so moving from one JavaScript framework to another JavaScript framework almost never gets prioritized simply because it's hard for leadership to see the value in some of these inconveniences when you might be able to spend a little bit of engineering time to get around them or deal with some annoyances or frustrations or whatever that may be, but it doesn't justify hundreds to thousands of hours moving multiple sites with hundreds to thousands of pages. It just doesn't really land. And so these sites gather dust and they stay on these old systems. And that's how we end up with these super legacy systems. And then eventually we make this really big leap, but it seems like it's justified for whatever reason. But now with AI agents, I started striking up a conversation with an agency that I used to work for because they had this project and they wanted to work through this process, and they had convinced the client that they had funds to be able to do this work. And I was chatting with them and have helped them get started on this process because I have felt like now that we've got AI agents, we can do this work for a fraction of the cost. Now, before I get into this, I want to explain a little bit about the architecture because the architecture involved in this project added to the complexity of it because it wasn't just one big site that we were moving. It was a suite of sites that were all connected to this shared component library. And so we needed to move the core of everything, but we also needed to move the sites, and the sites weren't complete copies, they were mostly copies. And so what we did was we picked one site and we moved the core along with that first site, and we kind of used that as our test. So the first thing I did was I put visual regression testing in place to establish a benchmark. So this first site had 317 pages on it. And so I built this visual regression testing mechanism, and then we ran it against production. And it basically took a snapshot at multiple screen sizes for every single one of those 317 pages. And then we used that as our benchmark so that what we could do is we could develop these new pages in this new framework. And then as we deploy those and we have deploy previews of them on Netlify, we can then take another snapshot and we can overlay them to see what that difference is. And that was going to be a giant, beefy amount of work. And so I wanted to automate that. So first, we built that visual regression testing process. And then we got our benchmark tests and we put those in place. And then the next thing I stood up was this custom agent team that was designed specifically to migrate from one framework to another in the context of this one project, knowing that part of this process was we needed to move that base level shared component library as the kind of the core of what we were going to work from as well. And so that team had this orchestrator that helped individual agents and processes work together. And essentially, it worked like this. So I had the baseline for these 317 pages. And then there was a project management agent. And what it would do is it would read this report if it existed. And if not, we'd hand it over to the developer. And the developer would do what it needed to do to change or to migrate one page from the old system to the new system. And there was then, and the intention here was that no content changes in the process. So we're going to have to build new base level components for anything that was on that particular page. And then we're going to have to provide site level overrides and site specific styles to match the existing page in production. So then the developing agent would do that, and it would provide this list of what it did, and then would hand that list off to the QA agent. And so then the QA agent would run this visual regression snapshot. It would compare the snapshots. And then if it found less than a 2% difference, it would approve it. And if it found more than a 2% difference, it would send it back to the PM agent to read the report, hand it off, go through the process again. And we would have, there would be multiple rounds. And so we would give the developer 3 chances to make it happen for every page. And this was a wild process. I was basically like, go. And then it took about, I think it took about 12 hours or so. Actually, it was more than that because it was over the course of several days where I just picked a chunk of pages and was like, go do these 20 pages, go do these 20 pages. So it took the better part of 3 days just churning this stuff out. And it was, maybe a gigabyte or more of markdown files and reports in this process because there was so much stuff to process. It actually broke the pull request. We couldn't even open the pull request anymore. And one of the colleagues' machines froze because he couldn't pull the code down to review it because there was just too much in the Git history. So we cleaned that up. And we decided to go a little bit of a different direction with the paperwork, which was really just we're going to put the paperwork on a different branch right now, and we're going to worry about the output on this branch that is the source of truth here that we're reviewing. So then on those 49 pages or so, we would bring in a human who would do that comparison, and we would decide what needed to change, and we could send the agent to those specific changes. We just made this big punch list like you would building any other site today. And everything else I did throughout this migration process was some form of this. It was establishing a loop for these agents to run in where we could just let them tinker with something, try it, hone it, get it a little bit closer. What happened, and the part that I didn't expect, was how long it took, how many rounds it took, and how frequently the agent just gave up. But it didn't give up in an obvious way. It wasn't like, nope, can't get this perfect. It was with the most confidence, it would say, done, here you go. But it wasn't done. It wasn't done. And then just this last week, working on a different project for Netlify, it's a giant PR that I've got open that is a lot of like moving things around. In fact, one phase in this first milestone that I'm working on was just changing one word to another word. And it was case insensitive, but it was contextual. And so it was changing this word to this other word as long as this context was right. And so I put an agent on that because I was like, this is a no-brainer, right? This is find and replace if. And it's the perfect thing for a non-deterministic system, right? Perfect thing for an agent. No, I cannot believe it, but it struggled. Now, in that case, and in this case, still loads faster than a human would have done this work. We can never know that because we're just not going to spend the time and money to do a one-to-one comparison. But I can tell you with a lot of confidence, it was faster. It was a lot faster, even though it was more frustrating, and I felt like it should have been even faster than it was. And so what it seems like is that the agent just gets tired. It either gets too much context that is irrelevant, or it just, for whatever reason, it kind of loses sight of what it was supposed to do. And so what I started to realize was that the paper trail is nice, but the paper trail guides one step in the process. We need kind of a higher level documentation approach for guiding this agent. And even then, it's not perfect. So it's the handoff back and forth, but the being really diligent about what's working and what's not working. And with this Netlify project, I was like, this is super simple. It's just a find and replace, but we needed a little bit of context on it. It would be a ton of work and a ton of really tedious work for a human. This should be perfect for an agent, but it was not working the way I wanted it to. In fact, so this is nothing to say against Claude, because Claude and Codex, they're constantly leapfrogging each other. It was just this moment in time. And so I put Claude on this work, and then I was like, okay, start a new session, uh, QA your work. Tell me what you missed and what you didn't, where you didn't apply that change. And write them down. Write down everything you checked and write down what applies and what doesn't apply and why you made those decisions. So it did that. It wrote like a, I don't know, it was a meaty markdown file. It was maybe like 15, 20 megabytes, because it's a big change. It's just a simple change, but it's a big change. And then I put Codex to work on that too. Codex wrote a markdown file that was more than a gigabyte, and it did it so fast. And it was like, nope, it missed this, 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 and this. Now, in that particular case with that Netlify project, one of the things was that Claude had a memory of approaching the project in a specific way. And my approach had changed slightly since then. And Claude still had that memory and missed the change in there and kind of reverted back to the previous memory. So it was like, no, these things are fine because you told me this is how we were building this project. Codex didn't have that coming in, so I gave it the new context and it got it right. But it was wild to see how different it was. So I played them off of each other. And I think that's really the big thing that I've come away from this with, is that what's important is to keep these agents really focused, keep the context really tight, do the research ahead of time, especially when the task is fairly straightforward. The discovery work is crucial. And I think that if I say I had one major mistake in the migration process that delayed it more than I would have liked to, it was that. Yes, we did the visual regression, but I think we could have been more diligent about how do we document this beyond visual regression? How do we put the majority of the energy into the discovery work so that the documentation is there? We use our human eyes and brains to read that and say, yep, that's what I want you to do. Now, go do it, check it off when it's done. And then when you give it back to me, here we go, other agent, QA the work, and we'll kind of create that loop. And so I feel like there's a ton of potential here to do this type of work in the future, but we really got to tighten up these loops a little bit. And one thing a colleague of mine has been doing lately has been exploring the concept of hooks in Claude. And he's got this hook built where when Claude is about to exit, it stops Claude from exiting and says, go back and read the task and review your work. And if you didn't do anything right, finish it. And he has said that it keeps Claude focused on the task and it doesn't introduce that fatigue and quit early. I think this can go different directions because I've also explored, like getting into that loop, but then what'll happen is something throws Claude in a weird way and all of a sudden it's like, oh, now I got to run my type checker in my dev server and I'm going to run the dev server locally, but then I got to put it in the background and I got to install this other dependency because I got to make sure that the dev server was running right. I'm like, hey, look, what happened? We were testing everything in a production like environment, so we didn't have to do all this shit locally on the computer. Why are you doing this? And this has happened to me several times this week. And what I found is that the response is usually, yep, I got distracted. So I think there's a lot to do still to help agents not sweep problems under the rug, to be honest and forthright about everything that they're tasked with and whether or not it actually has been addressed. And we've got to kind of work around that and find a better pattern to help these agents be successful when the level of complexity and of scope is pretty decently high, and just really hold these agents accountable for that attention to detail and putting those right mechanisms in place so that they can actually give you pixel perfection. And back to the earlier flow, 2% was way too much. A 2% variation in pixel perfection can look really, really bad. And so I think there's something still that I haven't quite nailed in terms of how do we help these agents achieve that pixel perfection when you move from one system to the other. I went in with the assumption of it's CSS, just lift the CSS. But the frameworks come with their own APIs. And so it's not always possible to have a one-to-one, hey, we're just going to copy this CSS over here and hope it's okay. It doesn't really work like that. And that was another big that was another really big surprise to me, is that I thought the easiest part of it would be being pixel perfect, and it wasn't. But it's been an interesting ride so far, and I'm fascinated to see where it goes from here. If you are looking to do something like this, or if you've gone through this process, I would love to chat with you all about your experience, or about what you're looking to do, and kind of dig into your project, because I think it would be fascinating to learn from each other. But that's it for now. I'm Sean C. Davis. I appreciate you watching. I'll see you next time.